Picture this. You're at a party, maybe four people in the room. You've got a drink in your hand, you're smiling at the right moments, laughing at the right jokes. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, maybe around the third conversation you've had about what you do for work, you start to feel it. That slow, quiet, sinking feeling. Nobody here actually knows me. And the strange part is you've been charming. You've been on. You've been conversational. By any external measure, you've been doing great. But the whole time, you've also been performing a version of yourself that's just slightly off, a little flattened, a little safer than who you really are. You drive home and you feel lonelier than you did before you went. That feeling, that particular kind of loneliness that comes not just from being alone, but from being unseen, is what this episode is about. Welcome back to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. I'm so glad you're here. Today in our episode, we're going to explore something that I think a lot of us carry around quietly and don't say out loud nearly enough. The difficulty of making and keeping real lasting friendships as an adult. And the even harder challenge of showing up in those friendships as your full actual self. This episode is not a listicle. We're not doing 7 tips to make better friends. I just want this to be a real conversation, or as close as I can get to one I'm having on my own, about why friendship is so genuinely hard, what we do to sabotage it, and what it actually looks like to be known by another person and to know them back. Now, I will say this episode actually started taking shape in my mind when I was editing the podcast for last week, the one about why it doesn't always feel good after setting boundaries. While I was editing it, I kept noticing that the two things were pulling from a similar place. I was noticing it as different thoughts and experiences came to my mind. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, it might be worth going back. They're not a series exactly, but they are in conversation with each other. So you don't have to listen to that one before you listen to this one if this is where you started, but you may want to listen to that one next. This one is a bit long, so grab a blanket, fix yourself a drink, and let's get into it. I want to start with something that I think gets glossed over a lot in conversations about friendships. And it's this: friendship as a category of relationship has never been structurally supported by the adult world. Think about it. Romantic relationships have massive social infrastructure around them. Entire industries, legal frameworks, cultural rituals, all designed to help you find a partner, commit to a partner, work through problems with a partner, so that you can stay with a partner. We have holidays that celebrate the partnership. We have therapists who specialize in it. We have vows. Family relationships have their own structure too. Obligation, proximity, shared history, and holidays that force you into the same room, whether you want to be there or not. But friendship gets basically nothing. There's no ceremony for it. There's no form you fill out. There's no culturally agreed upon checkpoint that says, this person matters to you, and now you protect this relationship. Friendship in the adult world survives entirely on voluntary effort. And voluntary effort is the first thing to go when life gets busy. This is not a new observation, but I think we underestimate how much it shapes our experience. Because when we feel lonely, when we feel like our friendships are fading, our first instinct is to blame ourselves. I'm too introverted. I'm too introverted. I'm too busy. I'm bad at keeping in touch. I'm not a good friend. I'm too much. I'm not enough. And I will say sometimes there is real self-work to be done there. But sometimes, probably a lot of the time, the friendship didn't fail because of a personal character flaw. It failed because we live in a world that doesn't build scaffolding around it. And then there's also the transition problem. Friendships form most naturally in places where you have repeated, unplanned interaction with low stakes. Developmental psychologists who study friendship, like Robin Dunbar at Oxford, have written about this. Proximity and regularity are the conditions under which closeness almost accidentally happens. You see someone every day. You don't have to plan it. You just keep running into each other. You talk because it's easy to talk. And over months, a friendship will form. School is the perfect friendship machine. You're thrown into a room with people your own age. You're kept there for hours every day, for years. You don't even have to be proactive. You don't have to schedule anything. The friendship just accretes like sediment, layer by layer, day by day. And then you graduate, or you move, or you change jobs, or you get married. And suddenly every single interaction requires intention. You have to text first. You have to suggest a date and coordinate calendars. You have to fight for a spot in someone's calendar, and they have to fight for one in yours. And if either of you is a little tired, a little overwhelmed, maybe conflict averse, the effort fades. The friendship stalls. And then one day you realize you haven't seen someone who once knew every single thing about you in 3 years. There's also something specific happening right now in this cultural moment that I think makes all of this harder. I don't want to be an alarmist about it, but I do think it's real. We've replaced presence with broadcast. Social media has given us this beautiful, terrible illusion of connection. I can see what you had for breakfast. I know you're on vacation or recently went. I've watched your dog's birthday video, but I haven't actually talked to you in over a year. Today we call this staying in touch, but what it actually is staying adjacent. It's watching each other's lives from a comfortable, low effort distance. It scratches the itch just enough that we don't go looking for the real thing. And so friendships that used to naturally deepen through conversation, letter writing even, or shared time, now just hover. They stay at the same level of closeness indefinitely because neither person has to reach out. They already know what's happening. Sort of, from a distance, if we choose to post about it. They may feel like they're connected, but they're really not. I don't think this is a moral failure, this adjacent connection. I think it's what humans do when given the option of an easier path. But I do think we need to name it for what it is. A substitute, not the real thing. So there is the social media part of it. And then there's another part of it that is more concrete. Because I think the most honest version of the problem shows up not on a phone screen, but in person. Let me give you an example. A lot of people have a version of girls' weekend or girls' night, the standing tradition, the group that's been together for years, the trip that everybody posts about. And I want to say something about those because as a therapist, I hear about them a lot. And the picture on the inside is often very different from the one they presented on the outside. So here's what I've learned. A lot of people dread going, not because they don't care about the people, but because attendance isn't really optional. If you skip, you know you'll be talked about. You'll be the reason for causing some drama. You have to explain yourself, and the explanation will never quite land right. So instead of dealing with that, you go. You show up. You perform the version of yourself that belongs in that group. The fun one, the easy one, the one who laughs a lot, makes everybody smile, and doesn't talk about anything too heavy. And the thing is, these are often the people who have known each other for a long time. By any external measure, these are close friends. There's history there. There are inside jokes. There's genuine warmth, probably. But here's the question that breaks my heart a little. What happens when something real is going on for one of those women? What happens when someone in that group is going through a divorce? Everyone is surprised. How could it not have worked out? He's so great. You two were meant to be together. Or the less obvious kind, the slow unraveling kind that hasn't been announced yet. What happens when their teenager is struggling with addiction and they're in the terrifying middle of it and they don't know how it's going to end? What happens when they're in the middle of a faith crisis? When something they built their identity around and even share with these other women no longer makes sense to them. And they don't even know who they are on the other side of it. Do they bring it to the girls' weekend? In my experience, from what I hear, and I hear this version of the story more times than I can count, the answer is almost always no. Because the group wasn't built for that. The group was built for fun, for escape, for the particular kind of lightness that comes with established social rituals. And somewhere along the way, an unspoken rule got set. We don't go there. So this person sits in the middle of the people who are supposed to know them best, who have known them the longest, laughing at the right moments, topping off their drinks, and carrying the heaviest thing in their life completely alone. They're at the girls' weekend. They're surrounded by friends. And they are profoundly aching alone. Now, that's not a failure of the individual. That's a failure of the structure. A friendship that can only hold you when your life is light is not built to do what friendship can actually do. And the cruel irony is that the obligation to show up, the fear of the drama, the social cost of absence, can make it harder, not easier, to find your way to the people and the conversations that might actually help. If you've already listened to last week's episode about why setting boundaries doesn't always feel the way we expect it to, I think this example is exactly one of the situations that episode was built for. The inability to say, I'm not going this time. And the inability to say, I'm going through something, come exactly from the same place. I think about this when I hear people talk about how lucky they are to have such a close group of friends. And yes, sometimes they are really lucky. But sometimes what they have is proximity and history, which can count for something, but it isn't necessarily the same thing as being known. Sometimes the group that has known you the longest is the one who actually knows you the least. Because the version of you they know is the one you curated for the group. Or it's the one that they knew when you were younger in your life. The real version, the one going through the divorce, the family crisis, the faith unraveling, she can't show up. Here's the question that I want to sit with. Why is it so hard to just be yourself in friendship? I know that phrase, just be yourself, has been so overused that it's practically meaningless. But when I'm using it in this episode, I mean something very specific by it. I mean, why do so many of us go through the motions of connection while simultaneously making sure the connection never goes too deep? Why do we laugh and share and show up and still somehow keep the most essential parts of ourselves tucked safely away? I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think it comes down to a very rational fear that we've never been taught to really look at and examine. It's this: if you really see me, the full version, the weird parts, the nerdy parts, the needy parts, the parts that don't make sense, the contradictions, the fears, the insecurities, the things I'm ashamed of, you'll leave. We call this fear of rejection, but I think it's even more specific than that. It's not just the fear that someone won't like us. It's the fear that personal evidence will confirm something we already quietly suspect about ourselves. That we are, at bottom, too much or not enough to truly be loved. That we are, in some fundamental way, unworthy of the friendship, of the kind of friendship that stays. And so we manage the presentation. We offer a highlights reel. We're fun, we're agreeable, we're interesting, but we stay in the shallow end and then we go home. And we find other people who are also staying in the shallow end. And we may have a perfectly pleasant time together, and we may call it friendship, and it's fine. It's all fine. But it's not what we're actually hungry for. Let me tell you about something called the vulnerability paradox. It's not an official psychological term. I've come to think of it in this way. The very thing that makes connection possible, which is vulnerability and openness, the willingness to be seen, is also the thing that feels most dangerous. Because to be seen is to be at risk. It's like we're handing someone ammunition. Like we are just saying to them, here are the things that could hurt me, and I'm going to tell you anyway, because I want to be close to you. Brene Brown has written extensively about this. And I think she's right that vulnerability is the birthplace of deep connection. But I also want to push something that I don't think she always gets into, which is the timing problem. Because the goal isn't to be vulnerable with everyone or to dump your full inner world on someone the first time you meet them. That's not vulnerability, the way she defines it. That's actually a kind of emotional flooding that can actually push people away. If that's your approach, that may be the very thing that dictates their response. Real vulnerability, the kind that builds lasting friendships, is graduated. It's a slow dance. I show you a little, I watch what you do with it, you show me a little back, and we build trust incrementally. Sometimes we might have a step backwards with our trust. And we talk about that. People take ownership over the parts that are theirs, which actually moves us forward in building trust. As the trust grows, so does the depth of what we're willing to share. And that's how genuine closeness happens. The problem is that a lot of us, especially those of us who grew up in environments where vulnerability was punished, or where showing weakness meant getting hurt, we never learned how to do this dance. We learned either to show nothing or to show everything at once. And both of those strategies fail in the same direction. They run past the gradual building of trust that deep friendship requires. I want to talk about masks for a minute, because I think most of us are walking around with several. There's the work mask, competent, professional, unflappable. There's the social mask, fun, easygoing, not a lot of baggage, or kind, thoughtful, but needless. There's the family mask, whatever you learn to be in order to survive your specific family dynamics. And then there might be a few niche masks. The one maybe you wear around your partner's friends. The one you wear around people you went to school with. And the one that comes out when you want people to think you have it all together. None of this is pathological. Code switching is real. It is normal, and some of it is healthy. You genuinely are different people in different contexts. And that's not fake. It's not dishonest. That's how human beings work. We all have multitudes. But here's the question worth asking. Is there anyone in your life who gets to see you without a mask? Is there anyone to whom you don't have to perform even slightly? Someone who knows your embarrassing opinions, your strange fears, your unpolished thoughts, and they come back anyway? Because I think a lot of people, if they're honest, would answer that question with, not really, no. I worked with a woman years ago, probably 15 years ago, maybe. No, I'm older than that. So it was probably 20 years ago. I think she was in her 60s. Her and her husband had been married 40 years or around there. I think that math works. In one of our sessions, I think we were talking about who in your life knows the real you. And she said, do you mean who's seen me without my makeup on and my hair done? And I said, yeah, sure. Who has seen you that way? And she was like, nobody's ever seen me that way. And I was a little perplexed and I said, not even your husband? And she said, no, he's never seen me without my makeup on and my hair done. And I probably would have been 30 at the time, something like that. And I was thinking, okay, I know she's an older generation than me, but it was also a little surprising. And I said, but you wake up in the morning and you probably have bedhead. And she was like, oh, you don't understand. And I said, apparently not. And she said, when my husband and I go to bed, I pretend I fall asleep, but I really stay awake until he falls asleep. And then I get up and take my makeup off. And in the morning, I always get up before he does. He gets up at the same time every day. I get up an hour before he does. And I do my hair, I do my makeup, I get ready for the day. And I said, you've never not done that? Like, even if you were sick one day, you didn't just have your makeup off and your hair not done when he woke up in the morning? And she said, no. And I said, has it ever occurred to him that he's never seen you with messy hair or bedhead or no makeup? And she's like, not that I'm aware of. We've never had a conversation about it. So that's a unique generational thing. And probably says something about where we have come from. That wasn't the case with my mom. I saw my mom without makeup, and I saw my mom with bedhead. But I had heard about those women. I had just never met one until then. And here's where it gets somewhat interesting. Because you might be thinking, okay, well, I don't go to that extreme, but I'm a pretty private person. I like my inner life kept to myself, and not everyone needs to be known in that way. And I will honor that. I think introversion is real. I identify as an introvert. There are people more introverted than me who genuinely need more privacy than others. And not every friendship needs to operate at the depth that I'm talking about. Friendly acquaintances and casual friends are a completely valid and valuable part of life. But I do want to push back on one version of this reasoning, which is the version that says, I'm fine, when what it really means is I'm scared. Because there is a difference between choosing privacy and armoring yourself against closeness and against imperfection. And sometimes we use the language of preference to avoid confronting the actual fear that's underneath it. The difficulty of being yourself isn't just about fear of rejection from others. A lot of the time, it's about the discomfort of having to meet yourself. When we drop the masks, we don't just become visible to other people, we become visible to ourselves. And for a lot of us, that's the harder part. Especially when our friend sees something in us that we can't or don't want to. Because underneath the performance, underneath the carefully curated self, there can be questions that we'd rather not look at too long. Questions like, am I interesting enough? Am I a good person? Have I made the right choices? Do I have anything real to offer? Deep friendship, the kind where someone knows you fully, requires you to know yourself first. And self-knowledge can be uncomfortable. It means sitting with the parts of yourself you'd rather not see. It means acknowledging the ways you've hurt people, the ways your wounds drive your behavior, and the ways that you sometimes aren't who you want to be. That is heavy work. And I think it's one of the underrated reasons that friendship is so hard. Because the invitation to be known by someone else is also at its core an invitation to know yourself better. And not everyone is ready for that. I want to challenge a few stories that we tell ourselves about friendship, because I think some of them actually make things harder. I think the first story that we tell ourselves that is not accurate is that real friends should be effortless. This one runs deep. We have this cultural idea, partly from TV, partly from nostalgia for the friendships of our youth, that if you found your people, it should feel easy. You shouldn't have to work for it. If you're scheduling time together, that feels like a business meeting. If you have to remind yourself to text them, if it sometimes feels like effort, you might wonder if they're not your people after all. And this is, I'm sorry to say, almost entirely backwards. The friendships that require the least effort are often the most shallow. They're the ones marked by circumstance and proximity. The coworker you see every day, the neighbor who's always in the backyard at the same time you are. The moment that circumstance changes, the friendship dissolves because it was never held together by anything more than proximity. The friendships that last, the ones that survive moves, marriages, children, career changes, years of silence, and fundamental shifts in who you are, those are almost always the ones where someone made a choice regularly to keep showing up. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered. I have two friends from high school, Jill and Julie. And there have been years of our friendship where maintaining it felt genuinely hard. Jill and I got married 2 weeks apart. I moved away for grad school. I started having kids. Jill and her spouse struggled with infertility. Julie got married 12 years after Jill and I did. We all have careers. Jill adopted 2 boys. Julie got married, had a baby girl, and 2 stepkids. And we were still pretty good about getting together for lunch or dinner quarterly. As our kids got older, it got harder to keep in touch. Months would pass. We'd talk about getting together, and then it wouldn't happen. And there were moments where I thought, maybe this is just the friendship running its natural course. It makes sense that we've grown apart. But every time we got together, we were ourselves again immediately. No warm-up period, no awkwardness, just people who knew each other deeply, falling right back into it, with room for the new person to also show up. And I realized the friendship didn't need constant maintenance to stay alive. It just needed us to refuse to let it become a thing of the past. So effort isn't the enemy of real friendship. Effort is often the expression of it. Story number 2 that we often buy into, but is not true, is that you need a lot of friends to not be lonely. Research on this is pretty consistent, and it tends to surprise people. The number of friends you have is almost entirely unrelated to whether you feel lonely. What matters is the quality and depth of even 1 or 2 of those relationships. Whether you feel genuinely known, safe enough to be honest, and whether you trust that other person is choosing you on purpose. A lot of people who are objectively, by the numbers, surrounded by friends, they have lots of people to hang out with, full social calendars, are actually profoundly lonely. because none of those friendships go very deep. And there are a lot of people who have one or two close friendships who live with a sense of connection and belonging that is genuinely sustaining. I think this is important information that matters because it changes what we're actually looking for. You're not trying to build a network. You're trying to find and be the kind of person that depth is possible with. One real friendship is worth 30 pleasant acquaintances when it comes to the thing that friendship is supposed to actually do, which is to make us feel like we're not alone in the world. Story number 3 that we buy into is if a friendship ends, it was a failure. Oh, this one. I have believed this myself. And I think we carry so much grief and guilt about friendships that run their course. And I just want to offer a different frame. Some friendships are seasonal. They're exactly right for a particular period of your life or a particular version of you that's facing a particular set of circumstances. And when you change or when your life shifts, the friendship doesn't necessarily have to stretch to fit the new shape of you. Some friendships are meant to just be a chapter, not run through the whole book. That doesn't mean those friendships don't matter. And it doesn't mean that they failed. A friendship that gave you exactly what you needed for 3 years or 5 years, and then naturally drifted into occasional check-ins, thinking of fond memories, that's not a tragedy. That's part of human life. Now, where I think it does become worth examining is when every friendship seems to end. When you look back and there's a pattern of closeness followed by rupture or followed by distance, that pattern might be worth getting curious about. We can't automatically assume or draw a conclusion if that pattern is there. But it is worth getting curious about. Not in a self-blaming way, but in a genuinely inquiring way. Are there certain things that keep happening? What role did I play in it? Is there something I'm afraid of that I keep running from right when things get real? Do I overlook certain things for the sake of the friendship that end up being a lot bigger than I thought? Because some friendship endings are just a part of life. And some might be the same wound playing out again and again. And those ones deserve our attention. So let's get into what it actually looks like, what the qualities are, the practices, the postures that allow a friendship to go the distance. The first one is consistency over intensity. We tend to think of deep friendship as the product of big moments. The road trip where you talked all night. The crisis that you got each other through. The time you laughed so hard you cried on the floor of someone's kitchen. Those moments are real and they matter. They become part of the fabric of a friendship. But what actually sustains friendship over years and decades is something much quieter than those things. It's the small, regular, low-key showing up. The text that says, "Hey, I heard this song and thought of you." The check-in after you knew they had a hard event or a hard week coming up. The habit of staying in each other's orbit. Not because something dramatic is happening, but because you care and you want them to know that you do. And you're genuinely interested. Researcher Gillian Sandstrom at the University of Sussex has spent years studying what she calls ambient awareness in close relationships. The idea that just knowing someone is thinking about you, even in small, unremarkable ways, creates a sense of belonging that is deeply protective against loneliness. You don't need grand gestures. You need somebody who keeps showing up in the small ways, consistently over time. The second quality is repair. Every close friendship will, at some point, involve some type of conflict and rupture. Someone says something thoughtless that hurts. Somebody's less available than they should be during a hard time. Somebody forgets something important. Someone changes in a way that creates friction. These moments are not defects in the friendship. They're a natural consequence of two complicated humans trying to stay close to each other across the inevitable moments of life. What separates the friendships that last from the ones that don't isn't whether conflict happens, it's whether repair happens. Repair requires a specific set of capacities that our culture doesn't always teach us well. The ability to say, I'm sorry, that was me. That's my stuff. I got it wrong. The ability to receive that apology without weaponizing the vulnerability it took to offer it. The ability to talk about what happened instead of just letting it silently calcify. And the willingness to be uncomfortable in the service of something you value. I've watched friendships that seemed unbreakable implode over things that could have been repaired with a single honest conversation. But one or both wouldn't have the conversation. Both people quietly hurt. Both people were quietly waiting. And eventually the distance became so normal that it became permanent. And I've also watched friendships survive things that seemed unsurvivable. Serious betrayals, painful silences, fundamental disagreements. Because both people valued the friendship more than they valued being right or being the one who wasn't hurt. Because they decided this person is worth the discomfort of the repair. If there's one skill that I would offer to people who want deeper friendships, I would say learn to repair. Practice saying the hard thing. Get comfortable with the awkwardness that comes before honesty. Because the friendships where both people have done the work of repair are almost stronger on the other side of it than they were before. You know something about each other now, that you can be trusted with the hard stuff. That's not easy to come by. The third quality is being a witness. This is one thing that I don't hear talked about enough. And I think it's one of the most essential things that lasting friendship actually does. To be a witness, to be a fair witness to someone's life, is to pay sustained attention to who they are across time. To remember what they told you 3 months ago and ask how it turned out. To notice when they seem different than usual. To hold a through line of their story even when they can't quite see it themselves. To say, I see what you've been through. I see how you've grown. I can also see what this cost you. There is something almost sacred about being truly witnessed, about having someone in your life who's been paying attention to you for long enough that they can hold your history in a way you sometimes can't hold it yourself. Who can say, remember how scared you were to do that thing? And you did it anyway. Somebody who knew you at 20 and knows you at 40 and can speak to both versions of you. This kind of witnessing doesn't happen quickly. It happens over years through accumulated conversations and shared experiences and the simple discipline of continuing to pay attention, to notice. It requires showing up not just in the shiny moments, but also in the dull ones or the hard ones. Asking questions, listening to the answer, not projecting your stuff onto their situation, and also caring enough to remember. And here's the reciprocal truth. To have a lasting friendship, you have to be willing to be witnessed. You have to let someone accumulate that kind of knowledge about you. You have to stop curating the parts of you they get to see, at least some of the time. You have to let yourself be known at a deeper level. I also want to get personal for a minute, because I think there are some specific friendship dynamics that I live with, that a lot of you might live with too. Maybe slightly different versions, but they're worth naming out loud. When I first started thinking about this episode, these were things I kept circling back to. The stuff I don't hear talked about very often. The stuff that is not in the friendship self-help books. I'm a therapist. And one of the quieter frustrations of my professional life, one I didn't expect and I was never warned about, is that it can be genuinely hard to make and keep friends who aren't therapists. Now, I want to be careful about how I say this because I want to get it right. I'm not complaining, just stating what I've learned. The problem is almost never something I'm doing. I'm not sitting across the table from a friend at dinner, internally diagnosing them, or filing away observations I'm making about their attachment style between bites of food. I'm their friend. I'm just there, the way any other friend would be. I'm laughing. I'm telling my own stories. I think I'm just being a person. But I've learned that something else can be happening that I can't control. Projection. When people know you're a therapist and it starts to sink in, they can begin to imagine things. I will say, as somebody in any profession, we become good at things that we do every day. And therapists are no different. I think therapists, not all therapists, but therapists can have incredible listening skills. They can have great observational skills. I, as a therapist, can spot patterns that nobody else put together, and they make sense to me. I just see them. And that's not because I'm sitting there analyzing or diagnosing anybody. It's just because I do those skills every day. But people that I'm at dinner with can start wondering if you're analyzing them. If you're noticing what they just said about their mother and you're making a note of it somewhere. If you see through them in a way that other people don't. If every pause that I take is interpreted as a clinical observation rather than just a pause, or me thinking and feeling about what they just said, that makes it difficult. There's almost nothing I can do about this. I can explain what I just explained. I can say, look, these are skills that I practice every day, and I've been doing that for 30 years. I'm really good at these things. That's not me showing up as your therapist. I don't want to be your therapist. And it's not what I'm actually doing. But if they're projecting onto me, what I might be doing, what they think I'm doing. I think that's more about the discomfort of being close to someone whose professional skill set involves understanding people, understanding human behavior. And the fear of that understanding can feel like exposure. I've had friendships that started well and then slowly curdled, not because of anything that happened between us, but because over time I could feel the other person becoming self-conscious in a way they hadn't been at the beginning. They'd catch themselves in a moment of vulnerability and they'd make a joke about it. They might say something like, "Oh, I guess you're diagnosing me right now." And I often say, "No, I'm not. I'm just listening." And they laugh it off. We laugh about it. But I also can feel that we turned a corner. That joke, when it starts showing up regularly, is a signal. It often is demonstrating that they don't feel safe being unguarded around me. Not necessarily because I've done anything to make them feel unsafe, but they've started performing for an audience that they invented or that they created. A version of me that's always watching, always evaluating, a version that doesn't actually exist, but that they believe. What's particularly frustrating about this, and I say this with as much compassion as I can, because I do understand it, is that it's almost impossible to disprove. If I say, "I'm not analyzing you," that's exactly what someone who is analyzing you would say. There's no move I can make that resolves the projection. The only thing that ever truly resolves it is time. And I find a lot of people don't stick around long enough for the projection to settle. So I found over the years that my closest friendships tend to be with other therapists. Not exclusively, but disproportionately. Because they can understand what I actually do all day. They know that I can compartmentalize it the way any professional compartmentalizes their job. They're not picturing me in clinical mode when I'm laughing at something funny that they did. They know those different rooms exist because they also exist for them. But that can have its own complications too, which I won't get into in this episode. The point is, sometimes who you are professionally reshapes how people experience you personally. And there can be a particular loneliness in that. And knowing that the version of you people are sometimes relating to isn't quite you. It's a character they've assembled from assumptions they're making. The second thing I want to talk about is something I also think happens a lot in midlife friendships. And I don't hear discussed honestly enough. The misalignment of needs. Here's what I mean. I've been in friendships with people who have never been married. And I cared about them. I made time for them one-on-one. They felt comfortable in my family. They knew my husband, my kids. They also had single friends. But it's different when one person is married and has a family and the other is single. It worked until it didn't. I've also had close friends who were in marriages that have been complicated. They're struggling, they're in transition. It's rocky in ways that adult marriages can become rocky. And I also care about those friends. I want to be there for them. I show up for them. But there's an asymmetry that I have to sit with. They have needs I don't have. Specifically, the need to process relational pain. to be held through the uncertainty of not knowing if their marriage is going to survive, if they're going to have a partner, to have a friend who witnesses the grief of loving someone and feeling far from them, or the grief of not knowing if you'll have somebody. These are real, legitimate, deep needs. And I think I've met them, at least partially, as a friend. The asymmetry is that I don't have the same needs coming back in the other direction. It's not a two-way thing. My marriage is pretty solid. It's not perfect, nothing is, but it is genuinely sustaining. The needs my struggling friends have and bring to our friendship often are met for me at home, which means I'm often in the position of giving more than I'm receiving in that particular kind of currency. I don't think I'm resentful of this. I'm not keeping score. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from a friendship where the weight of need is consistently on one side, where you're the stable one, the solid ground, the person they call, where when things get hard for you, it doesn't quite compute for them. It rattles them, actually, because you're so permanently the one who seems to have it all together. And over time, that creates distance. Not necessarily hostility or resentment, but there is a quiet drift because the friendship has been organized around a role that doesn't leave much room for the full complexity of who you actually are. You become, in a way, load-bearing in their life. And load-bearing things don't get to wobble. They don't get to need. They don't get to say, actually, I'm having a really hard time too. I don't think this is anyone's fault. People in pain pull towards stability. That's a very human thing to do. And if you're my friend, I genuinely want to be there. But it is worth naming for myself and maybe for some of you who recognize the role that you play in this dynamic. That being the stable friend, the wise friend, the one who can give more than they receive, can quietly hollow out a friendship over time if it's never balanced. If there's never a moment where the other person turns towards you with the same quality of attention and asks, what do you need? What's actually going on with you? The friendships that matter the most to me are ones where that question gets asked, where my friend can know intuitively or by habit that I'm also a person with an interior life that doesn't stop just because I seem steady on the outside, where they've made space consistently for the version of me that isn't anyone's rock, just a person, a friend, someone who sometimes doesn't have the answers and needs to be held a little too, but also somebody who likes who they are, knows who they are, and in a lot of ways has a genuinely satisfying life. If you're someone who tends to be the stable one in your friendships, I'm just saying that I see you. And I want to gently encourage you that it's okay to let people see that you need things too. It's okay to say it out loud. The right friends, the lasting ones, will not only handle it, they'll be grateful that you spoke up because it gives them something true to hold. It allows them to do something real for you. And that reciprocity is what keeps a friendship alive. There's a third thing I want to name here, and it's the one that took me the longest to find language for. It has to do with friendships that didn't end quickly or dramatically, but that lasted for a real substantial stretch of time, 5 years, 7 years, a decade even. Real friendships that mattered, and then somehow they ended. And I'm not entirely sure why. I've had several of those over my adult life. And for a long time, my default explanation was, I must not be a very good friend. I think that's where the mind goes first, especially if you're someone who tends towards self-reflection. You can replay the friendship, looking for where you went wrong, and sometimes you find things, small failures, moments where you could have shown up differently, but you didn't. And sometimes you look back honestly and think, I was present, I was invested, I showed up, I offered something genuine, and it still ended. We can only take inventory of what we know. What I've come to believe, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, as a therapist, we are reluctant to believe this, that there's a particular kind of friendship friction that can happen when you're comfortable in yourself. What I've come to believe, slowly and somewhat reluctantly, is that there's a particular kind of friendship friction that can happen when you're comfortable in yourself, when you have a settled sense of who you are, what you value, what you need and don't need. And specifically when a lot of your core needs are already being met, whether that's by your work, by your marriage, by your own inner life. Sometimes that security can be misread as distance. It can look like you're not visibly hungry for the friendship, not needing it to fill a gap, not leaning on it for something in your life that's missing. The other person can start to feel like the friendship is uneven in a way that has nothing to do with how much you value them. They might start to wonder, does she actually need this friendship? Does this matter to her? And no matter how many times you show up, if you show up from a place of fullness rather than need, it can read unfairly and incorrectly as not caring. Being a therapist layers onto this in an uncomfortable way. Because the security I've developed in who I am is at least in part a professional one. I've spent years sitting with difficult emotional material, learning to hold it without being destabilized by it. That steadiness is genuine, and it's a hard-won part of who I am. But I think some people watching me be steady start to interpret it as something else entirely. They don't call it stability. Maybe they call it superiority or judgment. I've been called intimidating. That one I've been called a lot. Or they just see it as distance. And I think it really boils down to not needing them in the way they needed me. And that's a particularly painful kind of loss. Because again, there's nothing you can really do to correct that perception. You can let them know that you value the friendship. You can say, I'm not analyzing you. I do need you, just differently than what you might expect or what you need. But words can only reach so far when someone has already decided what you mean. And if I'm being honest, I don't have a tidy resolution to this. I'm still confused about some of those endings. I don't always know what happened. And I've had to make peace with that uncertainty, which for someone who works in a field that values insight and understanding is its own particular challenge. What I've landed on is this. I don't think those friendships ended because I was a bad friend. I think some of them ended because the version of me that showed up, who was secure, present, not visibly needing, or I'm not in a crisis, I'm comfortable in my professional identity, was genuinely difficult for some people to be close to. Not because there was something wrong with me, and not necessarily because there was something wrong with them, but because the particular combination of who I was and who they were created a dynamic that over time didn't hold. That's not a character indictment of anyone. It's just that sometimes the pieces don't fit, even when both people are good people and they're trying. Even when the friendship was real and it genuinely mattered to both people. What I know now that I didn't know when I was younger, and these endings were fresh, is the ending of a friendship, even a long one, and even a good one, doesn't mean you failed at it. Just means both of you are human. And human things have lifespans that don't always correspond to how much they meant. So far, everything I've talked about in this personal section of this episode has been about the slow kind of loss. Friendships that faded, friendships that drifted, the gradual accumulation of distance that one day you look up and realize became permanent. Those losses are real and they hurt. But there's a particular ambiguity to them that at least leaves you somewhere to stand. Nobody detonated anything. It just stopped. But there's another kind of friendship ending that's completely different. And I want to talk about it because I think it's one of the least discussed and most devastating things that can happen in adult friendship. I'm talking about when a friendship doesn't fade, but it blows up. Where there is a moment or a conversation or an email after which nothing is ever the same again. I've had that experience. I think there's a lot more of us who have had that experience than talk about it. And I'm going to tell you about it because I think it contains something important about all the things we've been circling in this episode. About projection, about the cost of being yourself, about what happens when honesty becomes a thing that breaks something rather than saves it. In my late 30s and early 40s, my family moved into a new neighborhood. And fairly quickly, we fell into a close friendship with two other families. I'll call the two women Sally and Mary. Our kids were close in age. Our husbands also got along well. We vacationed together. We ate dinners together regularly as families. The kids ran in and out of each other's houses. It was exactly the kind of adult friendship that's genuinely hard to find. Or so I thought. It was grounded in proximity. We lived close and shared life, built over years. And I will say, if I'm being honest at the beginning of this, that it was real. It was real to me. The friendship was real and it mattered. Sally and Mary were both stay-at-home moms initially when we became friends, and I worked. At the time, I was working for another group practice, and during that time, I built my practice. My work was and is deeply meaningful to me. During the day, they spend a lot of time together, which I was aware of. I noticed it. And there were times I had to talk myself through it, letting myself know, hey, this isn't a threat. I choose to work. I can't be upset that they have more time during the day with each other. My work gives me meaning and satisfaction. Their closeness during the hours I'm not available is not a statement about my value in this friendship. And I would tell myself that, and I think that was true. I also want to name that it took active work on my part to keep believing that. Because the thing about being the one who is sometimes unavailable, even if it's your own choice, for good reasons, is that you can feel the edges of your place in a group shift in ways that are subtle and hard to name. I will also say friendships of three are notoriously difficult, and I've had several of them over my life. The one thing that can be hard is when two people spend more time with each other than the third person does. Inside jokes happen, and that's to be expected. There's nothing wrong with that. But you also should bring the other person into the inside joke, not just talk about the inside joke and not fill the other person in. Sally and Mary also had conflict, sometimes with each other, the kind that happens when you spend a lot of time with each other, maybe too much time with each other. And over the years, I played a role that I recognize as being genuine and complicated. I was often the mediator. If they had conflict, I'd hear about it separately from each of them. And I'd listen to both of them when they called me, and I'd encourage them towards generosity, reminding them that relationships have conflict, that repair is possible, and it's worth it because the friendship matters. I believed all of that, and I still do. But I can also recognize that in playing that role, I was absorbing something, some tension, some weight that I didn't really contribute to and I wasn't fully accounting for. One of my daughters and Sally's daughter were the same age, and they were friends. In sixth grade, though, something shifted between them. As far as I know, Sally's daughter was, and as far as I know, still is a deeply loving, sensitive, caring kid. But around sixth grade, I started hearing from Sally that my daughter was leaving her daughter out, that her daughter was coming home after school and just sitting on the couch, that she seemed lost. Around that time, both girls had been playing competitive soccer, but Sally's daughter decided she didn't want to continue with it. My daughter did, and she made the competitive team that year that they had both been part of. Sally pointed to that as another instance of my daughter moving forward in ways that left her daughter behind. My reading of that situation, of what was happening, was different. I believed, and I said this to Sally, this is an awkward transitional phase for girls. They're too old to play the way they used to, but they haven't figured out how to hang out yet. I told her, my daughter's also on the couch after school. I said, I don't think this is about exclusion. I think it's about two girls in the same uncertain in-between phase, each trying to figure out who they're becoming. I'm not sure Sally ever fully believed that or heard that. And I can understand why. When your child is struggling, you need somewhere to put that. Around the same time, I became aware that Sally's daughter had what she said she got at school, this deep cut on her arm, and she was keeping it bandaged. When Sally wanted to check on it to make sure there was no infection, she'd say, oh, I just changed the bandage. I don't want to have to unwrap the whole thing. You can look at it in the morning. Sally was just trying to make sure it wasn't infected. She was worried. And the more her daughter deflected, the more worried Sally became. One day, Sally called me and told me that morning she wouldn't let her daughter off the hook, and she insisted that she see the cut. And when she finally unwrapped the bandage, there was nothing there. No cut, not even a scratch, not even a red mark. And Sally asked me, "Is my daughter a psychopath?" I said, "No, of course she isn't. No." And I explained why I didn't think that's what was happening. And Sally said, "What should I do?" And that question was something I paused on. And I asked her, "Are you asking for my professional opinion, or do you just want my response as a friend?" And she said, "I want your professional opinion." And so I proceeded with that. I told her, I think this is a time and an age when girls our daughter's age need a great deal of emotional attention from their mothers. Not just being taken to lunch or going shopping, doing activities together, but real sustained emotional presence. And I said, "I know that you lost your own mother when you were really young. And I imagine watching your daughter struggle at this particular age is probably touching things in you that are very old and very painful because you didn't have a mother who could show up for you at this age." And I suggested that both her and her daughter might benefit from talking to a therapist. It was honest. It came from care. I would still say the same thing today because I believe it was the right thing to say. Also, I can say this today that if you're friends with a therapist, you probably shouldn't be surprised if they encourage you to go to therapy at some point. That's not a judgment. We go to therapy. We believe that therapy is helpful. A few days later, I received an email from Sally telling me she could no longer be my friend. That there were a lot of things that had led her to this decision, and she just needed to be done. One of the things I remember from that email that has stayed with me is that she said she had come to realize that her friendship with me had made her a worse wife, a worse mother, and a worse person. And then she asked me not to contact her again. Now, let's just sit with that for a minute because it is one of the most stunning things I had ever read in the context of a friendship. It's something I went to therapy for 2 years over because I believed it. Why would she tell me that if she didn't feel that way? My friendship with you made me a worse wife, a worse mother, and a worse person. I've thought about that a great deal. Those words were like set in stone. And what I've come to understand and believe after my therapist and I went through it so many times, although I'll never know for certain, is that what I said to Sally about emotional attention and about her own mother and about her daughter's need for something deeper than surface presence, I think it landed somewhere that was already raw. I don't think it was received as care. I think it was received more like an accusation. Maybe a mirror that she wasn't ready to look into. And rather than sit with the discomfort or what it reflected, she found a way to make me the problem. Now, this is not a condemnation of Sally. I can say today that people protect themselves the way they know how. But it's also worth naming what happened. I was asked what to do. I paused and said, do you want my professional opinion, or do you just need me to respond like a friend? Which is harder to separate than you might think. And I gave my professional opinion honestly, and I gave it with genuine love. And it was thrown back at me. Shortly after getting that email, I called Mary to tell her what happened. Mary, who I mediated on behalf of to work through the conflict for the sake of something that mattered. I had also invested in my friendship with Mary, just like I had with Sally. But when I called Mary, she told me that her loyalties lie with Sally and her family, and she hung up the phone. Both women blocked me on social media. Our children were no longer able to be friends with their children. My husband was no longer able to be friends with their husbands. And for 11 years, we still lived in the same neighborhood. And they did not speak to us. Not a hello if we crossed paths at the elementary school. Not a nod or wave as they drove past our house on their way out of the neighborhood. Not a single acknowledgement that we had once vacationed together and built this shared life together. 11 years is a long time to carry that, especially when you live close enough to see it and be reminded of it every day. Eventually we moved, not just for that. That was certainly one of the benefits of moving, but there were other factors that led to us deciding to move. And in 2020, 13 years after that email, Sally sent me a Facebook friend request. We had moved 45 minutes away just 2 years prior. I sat on that friend request for 2 weeks, debating in my mind, going back and forth. And then I texted her. I still had her phone number in my phone. I told her, I don't want to read more into the friend request than it was. It's just a social media friend request. But I also said I was genuinely confused because it seemed to me that she had gone to considerable lengths to cut me out of her life. And then 13 years later, she just sent this friend request as if none of it had happened. She responded and said, oh, I wondered if it would come across that way. All of this took place in text. She said she genuinely missed our friendship. She told me that over the years, she had followed our family on social media, unknowingly to us, keeping up with us from the distance she had created for herself. And then she said something I've turned over many times since then. She said, I don't remember why our friendship ended. 13 years. The effort that takes to sustain that erasure, to walk past my house and not see me as we crossed paths, to not see me as we crossed paths in the hallway at church, to make it 11 years without a single acknowledgement. And she didn't remember why. She suggested we go out to dinner. She told me that her and Mary had since had their own falling out, that she and her family had also left the church, that they were going through their faith crisis. They'd also moved closer to where we live now. And she'd love to share that with us and hear about our deconstruction. It was a little bit baffling to me. And I ended up telling her no. I was kind about it, but I said, we tried being friends and it hadn't worked. I've thought a lot about what the right thing to say about that story is, because I don't want to tell it just as a story about how someone wronged me and I eventually got it to be right. Even though there are parts of it that are that simple, it also isn't accurate. I also am not telling that story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of being honest, about being yourself, because I would give the same professional opinion again. I still believe it was right, and I stand by what I said. What I think it actually is, and what I hope it can be for anyone who has lived through something like this, is a story about what it costs to be fully yourself in a friendship, to bring your whole self, including your professional knowledge and your honest perception, to a relationship that just couldn't hold the weight of that honesty, and to survive it, to be bewildered by it, to grieve it, to live for years in the same neighborhood and feel the specific cold of it, and to survive it and be okay. And to eventually be able to tell the story plainly without it destroying you. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. If something like that happens and you get a friend request 13 years later, you don't have to respond. That's what I chose to do. That seemed to align with who I am. I did sit on it for 2 weeks. But I also want to say this. No response is also a response. And sometimes the most self-respecting thing you can do is say to yourself, we tried and it didn't work. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. The door that opened back then is not the same door that's available now. And you get to know that. And if you choose to, you get to say that. I also want to talk about what often doesn't get talked about enough in conversations about authenticity. Sometimes being yourself will cost you relationships. This is not a comfortable truth. The popular message is just be yourself and the right people will find you. Be authentic and you'll attract authentic relationships. And there's truth in that, but there's also a part of the story that gets left out. Authenticity is, in the short term, sometimes a filtering mechanism. And the filter can hurt. If you stop performing the version of yourself that certain relationships require, some of those relationships will end. Not because you changed into someone worse. You stopped being someone you never were. And the friendship, it turns out, was built on that performance. When the performance stops, there's nothing holding it up. And it's painful. It feels like rejection, even when it's freedom. It can feel like evidence that you're not lovable as you are, even when what's really happening is that you've outgrown a version of yourself that was not sustainable. And I want to talk about something that I think particularly affects people who grew up learning to make themselves small or easy or low maintenance in order to keep the peace or keep the people they loved close. Maybe your family, like mine, had a lot of emotional volatility. And you learned that the safest thing to do is disappear a little. Don't need too much. Don't take up too much space. Don't show the parts of you that might be inconvenient. This is a survival strategy, and it's a smart one when you're young and dependent. But if it becomes a friendship strategy, that's where it gets complicated. Because if you've spent most of your life making yourself smaller to keep people comfortable, you might find that when you start taking up your actual amount of space, when you start saying what you actually think, what you actually need. You express what you actually feel. Some people around you won't like it. Some will be genuinely confused. They might have liked the smaller version of you. It was easier. It didn't ask anything of them. Some will feel threatened. Your growth makes them aware, maybe for the first time, of the ways they've been keeping themselves small too. And some, not all, but some will actually rise to meet the fuller version of you because they're also waiting to do that. They were doing their own kind of shrinking, and your permission to take up space becomes their permission to also take up space. The goal of authenticity in friendship isn't to broadcast your full, unfiltered self to everyone all at once. It's to find slowly and carefully, through the graduated vulnerability we talked about earlier, the people who are worth the risk of being known, and to have the courage to keep being known by them, even if it's scary, even when it would be easier to pull back, and even when you've already been hurt before. Going back to the episode last week, just like setting a boundary requires you to know what you actually need, that is the same capacity that allows you to show up in friendship as yourself rather than as performance. Someone who hasn't done that inner work will struggle with both. The security, the settled sense of self that some people misread as not needing them is exactly what makes a boundary feel okay rather than catastrophic. It's the ability to not worry too much about whether the relationship will collapse because you know who you are with or without it. I've thought what to do with this next portion of the episode because in most conversations about friendship, whether that's podcasts or books or well-meaning articles, this is where you get the list. The 5 things to try, the habits of people with great friendships, actionable steps. And I don't want to do that. Not because I don't think there are wise things to practice, but because I think friendship is genuinely too complicated. There's too many particularities, and it's shaped by who you specifically are and who the other person specifically is, to be handed to you as a list. What works for you may be exactly wrong for somebody else. And I think I've spent too much time in this episode being honest about the real difficulty of this to end by suggesting it's manageable with the right to-do list. So instead, I want to offer something different. A few things I've personally stopped believing about friendship, and the beliefs I've quietly come to hold in their place. These are not prescriptions, just the honest residue of a lot of years and a lot of experience, including the painful kind. The first thing I've stopped believing is that a good friendship should be easy to maintain. I used to feel something close to shame when I realized I had to actively work to stay connected to someone I cared about. Like the effort itself was evidence that something was wrong. Real friendship shouldn't feel like labor, right? But I've come to think that's backwards. The friendships I've had to fight for are often the ones that have meant the most. Effort is not the enemy of closeness. For adults, effort is frequently the only evidence that closeness is real. The second thing I've stopped believing is that I can fully understand why every friendship ended. I have put real energy into figuring out what happened in friendships that ended, especially the ones that ended badly, suddenly, or without explanation. And I've had to make a kind of peace with the fact that I will not always know. Some endings have no satisfying answer. Sometimes the other person's internal world, their fears, their wounds, their particular way of needing things is simply not available to me. And the story they told themselves about what happened may have very little to do with what I experienced as true. That used to destabilize me more than it does now. I used to move very quickly towards self-blame because self-blame gives you something that you can do. If it was my fault, I can fix that. I can be different next time. But sometimes it wasn't my fault in any meaningful sense. Sometimes I was exactly and fully myself in a friendship, and that friendship still ended. And I've had to learn to hold it without it becoming a story about my unworthiness. The third thing I've stopped believing is that everyone wants the same depth from friendship that I do. This one also took me a long time. I think I assumed for years that deep connection was something everyone was seeking, that everyone was hungry to be truly known and truly seen, truly held by another person in the way that I've been describing in this episode. But that's not true. Some people are genuinely satisfied by lighter friendships, by fun and warmth and shared activity without a lot of emotional depth. And that's not a failure of imagination or courage on their part. It's just a different orientation toward friendship. Misreading that and approaching someone with the full depth of what you're capable of, expecting the same in return, can set everyone up for disappointment. One of the more useful shifts I've made is trying to meet people where they actually are, in terms of what they want from friendship, rather than where I want or need them to be. And then there's what I've come to hold instead of all of the things I've let go of. What I hold now is something simpler and harder than any list. It's the belief that friendship, real friendship, the kind that knows you and stays, is one of the more extraordinary things available to a human life. Not because it's easy to find or uncomplicated to keep, but precisely because it isn't. Because it requires two people, two different people, separately imperfect and separately insecure and somewhat afraid, to keep choosing each other across all the ordinary and extraordinary difficulties of being alive. I hold the belief that the grief of a lost friendship, even one that ended with a blow up, even one that ended badly, even one that ended in silence and 11 years of passing each other without a word, that's legitimate grief. You don't have to minimize it or explain it away or tell yourself it wasn't that meaningful. It was real. The loss is also real. And you're allowed to let it be heavy for as long as it needs to be. I also hold the belief that knowing yourself, really knowing yourself, the way I hope this kind of honest reflection brings you closer to, is not separate from the work of being a good friend. It's the work. Because you cannot be truly known by someone else if you haven't done the harder prior work of knowing yourself. That's one of the things that no list will ever give you. And I think it's the only thing that makes the rest of it possible. I've been thinking lately about what I'd call the gift of a long friendship. A friendship that has genuinely lasted, that has survived your life changes and theirs, that's been there in the major seasons of your life. The gift isn't just that they know you. There's also something beautiful about being known across time. They've seen you before you had the confidence you have now. They remember who you were when everything was uncertain. They have a memory of you that extends before your current chapter. And they carry that. I think it's one of the most quietly profound things that another person can do for you. And that gift you only get through time, through the sustained, imperfect, sometimes awkward, sometimes breathtaking practice of continuing to choose each other, of continuing to show up, of saying, not necessarily with words, but with your actions, you matter enough to me to keep going, to keep being known by you, and to keep knowing you back. I think that's what lasting friendship actually is. It's not a feeling or a label. It's not chemistry. It's not even compatibility exactly. It's a choice made over and over by two people who've decided that what they have is worth the effort of keeping. One more thing before I close, and I genuinely mean this because I think it often gets left out of conversations like this one. If your best friend is your spouse, that counts. If it's your adult child or a sibling, someone who has grown into a person you genuinely like, whose company you seek out, who knows you in the particular way that only someone who has watched your whole life can know you, that counts too. The kind of being known we've been talking about all episode doesn't have to live in a separate category labeled friend. What matters is that the quality is there, that witnessing, the choosing, the willingness to be seen and to see in return. If you have that in your marriage or with a sibling or with your adult children in some combination that doesn't fit a tidy social category, please don't let anyone make you feel like you're missing something. You're not. You've found the thing. It just also fits in another container than you thought it would. If you're someone who feels like lasting friendship has been hard to find, or if you feel like you've been on the outside of the kind of closeness you actually want, let me leave you with this. The longing is information itself. It tells you that you want to be known, that you're capable of caring about people, that you have something worth offering and something worth receiving. That's no small thing. The friendships that last aren't found fully formed. They're not something we can make a list of, everything I want in a friendship, and then copy and paste. They're built slowly, imperfectly, through risk and repair and all the small accumulations of time and attention. They are built by people who are willing to be a little bit vulnerable and brave and present. Thanks so much for listening to this episode today. If this episode resonated with you, or if it reminded you of a friendship you want to tend to, or if it gave you language for something you've been feeling, I'd love to hear about it. Reach out, send me a message, leave a review, drop a comment. Make sure you're subscribed. Take care of each other out there, and I'll see you next week. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.